Now let's look at how we can use a for loop to read information in from a file. In this example, I am going to open up a file that I used in an earlier video, and it's the sample DNA_1000.txt file. So let's look at that file again so we can remember what it looks like. So here it is, and it has 1,000 bases that are scattered across about 17 lines. So you may remember that we had 60 bases per line, and since the line stops here, there's an end of line character that's also included. So each one of these lines has 61 characters, but the file has a number of lines in it. So how can we use a for loop to read this information in? Well, that's what we're going to explore in this exercise or this video. So let's get started with that. Of course, we need to open the file. So we have our file pointer called File, and then we will open up the file itself, which is located, in my case, it's on the C drive in the temp folder. Now, once we've opened it up, it's very easy to read from the file. So let's describe what we're doing. I'm going to put some code in that's going to read and print each line from the file using a for loop. Here's how we do that. It's very simple with the for loop. We have our file pointer here, and with the for loop, we say for line in file. So this reads exactly one line from the file. And we can put a comment to that effect. So this statement then, it just reads in one line from the file and it saves it in the variable line. Now in its simplest form, let's print these lines out to the screen. So we'll do print line, and then we'll do the close parentheses, and that's the only thing we have in the loop. Now remember, I like to put a comment after the for loop to indicate that we have reached the end of the loop. So I'll do that here. Now let's run the program and let's look at how this progresses through the file. So here you see the output, and you can see that we print out each line to the screen, and there are so many lines we need to actually scroll down to see the entire file. But each time we go through the loop, the for loop will input one line and then it will print it to the screen. Then we go through the file again, we get the next line and we print it to the screen, and so on until we reach the very end of the file. Now let's add some code to this loop so that we can count the lines as we go. So let's add a counter to this. Before the loop, I'm going to just add this line of code, and I have a variable called line_count, and I'll set it equal to 1. Then as we go through the loop, I'll just add 1 to this counter each time, and then we will count how many lines we have, and we'll print out that number of lines as we go. So each line will have a number associated with it. Now, since I do want to print out the line count, I'm going to make this print statement a little bit longer. So I'm going to print out the word line, and then I'm going to convert this line count to a string and print that out next. Then I'm going to print out a space, a dash, and a space. That will separate this number from the line itself, and then we'll print out the line over here. So that's the line that was read in with the for loop. Now, as we go through this loop, I want to count the lines, so I need to add 1 to my line count each time. So now let's update our counter. So I'm just going to have this line which says take the current value of line count, add 1, and then save that as the new value for line count. Now we have the output. So I'll bring it up, and we can see now that each time we go through the loop, I'm going to print out this line 1 to the left of the line. So we'll print that out with a dash and then the data that we read from the file. So you can see that we end up with 17 lines in the file, and the for loop reads them in one line at a time. Well, that's good, but notice that there's some spaces between here. So we have this line 1, and there's a blank line and a blank line between each one of these. So if you want that, then that's okay, but if you'd rather not have it, then we need to do something that you may recall from an earlier video. When we look at the file, there's a end of line character, that \n at the end of the line, and we had to strip that out earlier if we didn't want that to be part of our file or part of the data we read in. So to make this look a little neater, let's go ahead and strip out that leading \n that shows up at the end of each line. Now the way we do that is we use the rstrip method. So once we have read the line from here, the top of the for loop, before we do anything else to it, let's take away that leading \n. So here is how we can do that. We take the line again and we use .rstrip, and we want to strip off the \n at the end of the line. So what this line does is it deletes the end of line character, and then it saves that modified line in the variable line. So I'm really just making an update to the line that I read in by doing the strip part of it here. All right, so now we will still count it and we'll still print it out, but we aren't going to have that \n to skip those extra lines. So now let's look at the output. And now it's much neater, I suppose, if we don't have the extra spaces between. So by removing that \n, then we don't go to a new line here. The reason we do get to the next line in this example is because when you do a print always adds an extra end of line. So we were getting 2 of those earlier. So now here is the file. So we see all 17 lines. We go through the for loop, we read one, we print one until we get to the end. We had looked at other instances where you could read in everything from the file and use it with just a .read statement or a .read method. But in a lot of cases, you don't want to read the whole file. You just want to read part of it. So with the for loop, you have a way to do that. In this instance, we do read every line one at a time. But as we read in each line, we can do some processing with it. So we're not doing much here. We're just printing it out. But if we wanted to search for something within that line, then we could do so. If you wanted to do a replace, you could do that. If you wanted to count the characters or stuff like that, you could. So this allows you to just process one line at a time with the for loop. Now to illustrate some processing that we can do, let's take this for loop that we just did. I'm just going to make a copy of the whole thing here. I'm going to copy it and I'll paste it down here. And we'll do some processing now that we've read in the file. So again, I'm going to start over. I'll set the count to 1, and we have all the stuff here we did before. But I want to add one additional thing to this. I want to count how many characters we have per line. So I'm going to use the len, L-E-N function, to count the lines, a number of characters in each line. Now, in this example, we could count them before we take off the \n or afterwards. So let's do it afterwards. So we'll strip off the end of line character, and then we'll get the length of the line. And we do that by using the len function. So we just take the line, we read in here, we strip off the \n at the end of it. Then we are going to use the len function to get the length, and we'll save it in the variable length over here. Now, if I want to see what that length is, I'll need to print it out. So we'll modify our print statement a little bit. So this time, I'm going to print out the length. Okay, so we determined the length just previously, right here in this line. So now I'm going to print out line as we did before, and I'll print out the count, but I'm going to say it has this many bases. All right, so this is going to print out line 4 has 17 bases or something like that. So we need to take the length. The length is an integer, which was determined here. And because of that, if we're using this concatenation operator, we have to convert it to a string. Okay, so you may remember you probably remember that well since we've done it so much. Okay, and then we'll add 1 to the count. And now we're at the end of the loop, so I want to make sure I've copied and pasted my comment here to that effect, because I like to see the end of the loop specified so I don't get confused. Let's bring over the output. Now, if you look at the output, then this output here came from our first loop. Okay, so for line and file, we counted the lines, we printed out the line number, and we printed out the line. But I don't get anything else. So I'm not seeing anything from that second loop, the one down here where I want to count the number of characters. So I don't see the print statement line has so many bases anywhere. So what's gone wrong? Well, nothing really has gone wrong. It's just that we have made our way through the file sample DNA 1000, this first loop up here, it went through the file from the first line all the way to the last line. When it gets to the last line, it doesn't automatically go back to the first line. So when I try to read in more data from the file, then there's no more data to read. So before I can do this second for loop, I need to do something to reset the file to the very beginning. The place that I put the code to do that has to be after this first loop and before the second one. So before I can read in more data from the file, then I need to reset the file to the beginning. There are different ways to do this, but one of the simplest ways is to close the file and then open it again. So we clean up the file by closing it, and then we open it again, and we'll be at the top of the file. So we have to reset the file to the beginning before we can do the second loop. So remember that. Once you have progressed through a file, then if you want to go through that file again, then you must reset that file by closing it and then opening it again. Now that's the only thing I did. Okay, I just closed it, I opened it, and just to add some space between the outputs, I printed a \n to skip a line. Okay, so now we should get the output from the second loop. Let's look at the output. So here you see the output from the first loop. We count the lines 1 through 17, and we print out the line. But our second loop, it doesn't print the line. It just prints out how many bases there are. So we print out the line count and how many bases it has, and the statement says line whatever has so many bases. So here is the output from the second loop. So we still have the lines 1 through 17, and we have the number of letters or bases in each line. So they're all 60 since we stripped off the \n, except the last one has 40. So this illustrates then how you can use a loop, a for loop, to make your way through a file one line at a time. There's another way that you can do the same thing. That is, read in the entire file into a variable first, and then you can use your for loop to go through that file. Now, let's suppose we want to read in the data and store it into a variable. So I'm going to put this line of code here, and I'm going to call my variable all_lines, and it will contain all of the data that's in the data file. The method I'm using for that is read lines. Okay, so look at this carefully. It's S over here. So you have seen already we can use read. That reads in everything from the file. And we can do a read line, L-I-N-E. And if you do a read line with no S, that reads one line. But if you use read lines, then it reads all the data from the file into this variable, and it makes it a list. Okay, so all lines is going to be a list this time. And we've seen already that the for loop works really well with a list. So don't confuse read lines with read line and just read. So know that how those three different methods are, how they work and how they're different. Now, this has read all the data from the file, and we've stored it in this variable, so now it's in the program. So we don't need to read the file again. Now, instead of using the for loop looking at the file pointer, then I am going to look in a variable, the variable all lines, where all the data now resides. Okay, so I can just make a copy and replace file with all lines. So now I don't need to reset this file anymore. Okay, so since I've got the data already contained in a variable in the program, I'm not going to go back and read the file again. So I can remove that reset altogether, and down here, when I want to go through the loop a second time, I can use all lines here instead of file. Okay, so it didn't make many changes, right? I used the variable all lines. First of all, I read all the data into that variable, all lines, and it is a list, so I can use my for loop to go through a list. So I just changed file to all lines here and here. And now everything will work the same as before, but I don't have to reset the file. So let's look at the output. So I'll bring the output window over. And here you can see from the first loop, we have this output, which is the line count and the actual lines themselves, and we've stripped off the \n. And now the second loop, we have the line counter and we count how many characters using the LAN function, and the last one is 40. So there's a couple of ways now that demonstrated that you can use your for loop and associate that with a file. So you can read one line from the file at a time if you want to by using the file pointer in your for loop, or you can read in all the data, put it in a list, then you can go through the list instead of going through using the file pointer. So those are some very powerful things that you can do with a file and with the for loop.